Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Find out more at patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Fillmore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 364, Watson a la mode. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you in Morley mode today?
Oh, Morley or less, yeah.
I like that. We are talking about the final entry in our series from this master's class series of episodes. As you know, every month we do a master's class theme where we look at a piece of masterful Sherlockian scholarship from the days of yore, and we share it and offer some critiques and commentary. We've been doing it's a quartet of Sherlockians this year, two from across the pond and two from the United States. Who have our scholars been this year?
Well, we've had, quite a collection. We've had, I think it's a very good sample. So in addition to Christopher Morley, obviously Michael Harrison, which in the prior quarter we did, and Edgar Smith, the great American Sherlockian.
Yes.
And
Trevor Hall.
Trevor Hall, right, who isn't American at all. That'll teach you.
Right. And Christopher Morley is bringing up the rear for us here in the final quarter of the year. So we will be in good stead listening to what he has to say. And just by way of reference, we mentioned Christopher Morley just this week on the Sherlock Mondays podcast from the Rosenbach Museum and Library. We were fortunate enough to join Ed Pettit and Monica Schmidt over there as a prelude to the Blue Carbuncle that they were discussing. And as part of that, we discussed Morley's essay that was part of the introduction of the BSI's edition of the Blue Carbuncle from 1948. Just a wonderful essay that really brings out, I think, the best of Morley. I think he was at the height of his powers in 48.
Well, he was indeed, highly experienced. He was born in 1890, but sadly, in 1948, he would live perhaps 9 more years and died in 1957 and had quite a period of ill health. So his spirits dropped considerably, owing to all of those challenges in those latter years.
Well, we are fortunate to have him and his scholarship. And this episode, we're talking about Watson a la mode, which appeared in the Baker Street Journal's first issue in 1946, Volume 1, Number 1. It was written under the pen name of Jane Nightwork. So we'll get into Watson a la mode in just a moment. As a reminder, you can find the show notes for this episode at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Specifically, this is episode 364. We'll have any links to books, articles, etc. that we reference during the show here So you can check those out either on the website or in the podcast app in which you happen to be listening to us right now. We should also note that we do have the opportunity for folks to listen to the show ad-free. Our Patreon supporters, for as little as $1 a month, are eligible to do that. And at various levels, they also get thank you gifts. And I'm going to add one bonus comment in here too, just for our Patreon supporters. If you are not yet a Patreon supporter, you can participate in this. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/trifles, or just that link in the show notes. But here's the ask. We have one episode left this season, episode 365. If you can guess the title of that episode, of episode 365, we will send you something from the Trifles vaults here. A bit of Sherlockian scholarship or a tchotchke or something that can adorn your Sherlockian collection. So, what is the title of the next Trifles episode? If you get it right, just drop it in an email at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. If you get it right, we will send you a prize. So check that out. Well, Bert, I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this episode, Watson a la mode, because frankly, I am in the mood for some ice cream.
Great Sherlockian desserts. I wonder if, in addition to people who get their just desserts thanks to Sherlock Holmes, there's a larger topic here that we could explore about Sherlockian desserts. That's very clever. I like that.
Yeah, well, the flan with the twisted lip, I think, would be one.
I've done that, the crooked flan.
The crooked flan, there you go.
Yeah.
That's just a little off-kilter.
Yeah, well, or off-kilt. Well, today we're going to be talking about Watson, as you pointed out, Watson a la mode. And you mentioned earlier Jane Nightwork. And this sort of gets us into Morley's character. Jane Nightwork was a occasional pseudonym he employed for things that would appear in the Baker Street Journal. I don't know if he used it anywhere else. But Jane Nightwork goes back to Shakespeare. In Henry IV, Part 2, we find out that Jane Nightwork is a woman of the evening who is discussed by Falstaff and another character. And so here we have Watson a la mode, and it's really about the feminine and couturier side of Watson's character, a side that no one would have associated with Watson. And it's worth pointing out that Morley's, one of his great successes as a writer was the novel Kitty Foyle. And the novel about Kitty Foyle is about a woman a young girl trying to make her way in business. And a lot of things happen in that book. Particularly an out-of-wedlock pregnancy and other things that were not usual for 1939 novels. It was made into a film with Ginger Rogers and became really quite popular. But this is an aspect of Morley's character, his sensitivity, perhaps, to women and the womanly perspective. And also we know that he said it, I think at some point, that parts of Kitty Foyle were based, the character's personality were based on his mother, I think, or else that's been observed by other people. But anyway, here we have, this particular story, and it comes on the heels of the other things that we've been talking about Christopher Morley. In October, we did with Sherlock Holmes in American, but just last month, we did Dr. Watson's Secret, which was Morley's suggestion that Watson and Mary Morstan had been married earlier, and why they might have delayed that. And so now we get to Watson a la mode.
Yeah, and it begins really setting the tone for us, as you say. Watson was a couturier at heart, and Morley writes, I don't need to remind you that he was first attracted to Mary Morstan because she was, quote, dainty, well-gloved, and dressed in the most perfect taste. What he admired about her neat tailor of grayish beige was that it was untrimmed and unbraided. So he approved of the small turban relieved by a suspicion of white feather on the side, then watched it from the window as Miss Morstan went down Baker Street. It's these little glimpses of details that Watson notices and includes in the stories that really help bring the scenes to life for us, and particularly with the sign of 4, where we are to believe, and I think it's reasonable, that Watson was smitten. He gives us good reason for why he was smitten. Later on he talks about the large pale blue eyes and, just Miss Morstan's demeanor under pressure, etc. But it's really framed by Watson's first observation of, what is the most obvious, and that is her outward appearance, her clothing.
Yes. Morley tells us it was not until a later occasion when Mary sat under the lamplight in the basket chair that he learned that she did the dressmaking in Mrs. Forrester's household. And so he praises the white diaphanous material with a little touch of scarlet at the neck and waist, and she replies, "I made it myself." And what more surely enlists a prudent man's enthusiasm? But as you point out, it's a remarkable sensitivity. If you ask people or think broadly about Watson, you tend to think of him as rather solid, stolid, not particularly imaginative. But here, and we'll find in the remaining paragraphs of Morley's essay, Watson à la mode, a lot that causes you to adopt a different perspective, a different view about Watson. And Morley takes us on to Miss Mary Sutherland. He says Watson's description of her was because she was so horrified by her mauvais tenue, her bad clothing. The hat, that Watson observes, was preposterous. Slate-colored straw with a huge red feather. Her black jacket was beaded and fringed and had purple plush at the neck and sleeves. The fur boa and muff that she wore were undoubtedly scraggly. The gray gloves were worn through, and the dress above the unmated shoes — she's wearing 2 different shoes — was a brown darker than coffee. Well, her whole costume horrified Watson's taste in millinery and mode. And he says, Morley points out about the Mary Sutherland case, his taste had been keenly trained by that time, for he had not long been married.
Yeah, and we'll get to the marriage part in a little bit, but that's, really to be held at odds with how Watson described Mary Morstan. 2 different ends of the spectrum of female attire from this particular class of female. Obviously, we're not talking about blue-collar women or servants or whatnot, but it's a wide range here, and I think Watson's I don't know if it's disdain, but maybe humor about the state of attire of Mary Sutherland kind of told a little bit about his and Holmes's assessment of just her demeanor in general.
Yeah, what sort of personality she had.
Yeah.
As far back as Silver Blaze, that's 1881, Morley observes, Watson became aware of the financial possibilities of the dressmaking business because, as you might recall in that case, there's a bill from a dressmaker. Now, Morley says Watson didn't comment at the time on Madame Lesurier's bill, which included an item of 22 guineas for a single costume, dove-colored silk, with ostrich feather trimming. For Straker's, this is Straker's friend, what Morley calls Straker's fancy lady.
Hey, fancy lady!
That's right. And Morley says, in these early cases, we don't hear a lot, about these sort of dressmaking touches. Even poor Helen Stoner, and Helen Stoner, of course, speckled band, her frill of black lace was not mentioned as glamour, but it's because it hid the 5 livid bruises on her wrist. But see how after meeting with Mary Morstan, how much more technical realistic the doctor's female observations become. And then Morley gives us a lovely comparison, 2 columns. One column of what Holmes has to say, and the other column what Watson has to say about very female characters.
Why don't we do this? Why don't I give the Holmes remark from the story, and you give us the Watson remark from the story?
Oh, good. I'd love to do that.
Yeah. So in A Scandal in Bohemia of Irene Adler, Holmes says, "The daintiest thing under a bonnet, a lovely woman with a face that a man might die for."
And Watson says, "Her superb figure outlined against the lights."
Va-va-va-voom! Hey! In The Man with the Twisted Lip, about Mrs. Neville Sinclair, Holmes calls her "this dear little woman."
A little blonde woman clad in light mousseline de soie, with a touch of fluffy pink chiffon at her neck and wrists, her figure outlined against the flood of light.
Oh, boy. I gotta loosen my collar here. About Violet Smith in The Copper Beeches, Solitary Cyclist.
Yes.
Holmes says, "There is a spirituality about the face."
Young and beautiful, tall, graceful, and queenly.
Of Anna Coram in The Golden Pince-Nez, attired like a lady.
At the best, she could never have been handsome.
That one stings. And then finally in The Second Stain, Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope. "The fair sex is your department."
The most lovely woman in London. Subtle, delicate charm. Beautiful coloring of that exquisite head. White gloves. Framed for an instant in the open door. A dwindling frou-frou of skirts.
Oof. Well, boy. And, well, is this the canon or Penthouse Forum? I mean, this, Watson's getting a little close to the emotions here. Morley goes on, and he mentions at the Abbey Grange, Lady Brackenstall elicited Watson's double instinct for both form and garb. "I have seldom seen so graceful a figure, so womanly a presence, and so beautiful a face. Blonde, golden-haired, blue-eyed, a loose dressing gown of blue and silver, a black sequin-covered dinner dress."
Morley says these boudoir details filled Watson's mind so that he apparently gave no medical attention to the hideous plum-colored swelling over one blue eye.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we pause here and see if we can cool ourselves down, and we will continue with Watson's observations at home right after this brief word. We're now in the 4th quarter of the year, and the Baker Street Journal is going as strong as ever under editor Dan Andriacco. We've just seen the cover for the autumn issue, and it is a doozy. Full-color rendering of Professor Moriarty's head and shoulders from Sidney Paget's famous illustration. Well, that's not to say the professor had dandruff. Far from it with his bald pate. But we see the details of Paget's genius close up. And that's what the Baker Street Journal allows us to do with all kinds of scholarship and creative writing, to focus on the details of some aspect or another of Sherlock Holmes and his world, just like we do here on Trifles. If you haven't gotten a subscription for 2023, it's not too late. You can still subscribe, get all of the issues to date, and be signed up for the Christmas annual. Just go to bakerstreetirregulars.com and subscribe to the BSJ today. Okay, we last left you here in the steamy pages of the canon with Watson's observations about form, figure, and and garb. And now let's turn to Watson's observations in the home. Recall he sought out and married Mary Morstan partly because of her fine attire. But what do we see in The Man with the Twisted Lip, Bert?
In The Man with the Twisted Lip, well, here we find Watson being much more discreet, Morley tells us, when he's in his own home, because here his wife's friend, Mary's friend, Mrs. Isa Whitney, has come to call, and Watson only says, she was clad in some dark-colored stuff.
He's got to watch his tone around Mrs. Watson.
Yeah. And so different, when he's on the Boscombe Valley case and he sees Miss Turner, one of the most lovely young women I've ever seen in my life. Violet eyes, shining, pink flush, her natural reserve lost.
Yeah, he's a little more freewheeling when he's on the road with Holmes, I guess. But here's an interesting thing. Morley writes, Watson's silences are sometimes as revealing as anything he says. He was too shrewd to argue against Holmes's frequent foolish complaints that women's motives are inscrutable. Here we might have the Watson in the nighttime saying nothing and that meaning a great deal. But he wonders if Watson had written The Lion's Mane, we surely would have seen beautiful Maud Bellamy in clearer circumstance.
Yeah.
Holmes wrote that she had the soft freshness of the downlands in her delicate coloring. But only if Watson had been there might we have at least seen, quote, a touch of white at the neck and wrists.
Well, now remembering Morley's Kitty Foyle novel and the story of this young white-collar girl who wants to make her way in the world, Morley says, am I too fanciful to think that good old John Hamish Watson was the first Victorian? Now, by the way, here he is importing Dorothy L. Sayers' premise that the H stood for Hamish. He says, Watson was the first Victorian, perhaps, to do justice to the earliest white-collar girls. Do you remember Laura Lyons? Laura Lyons, of course, from The Hound of the Baskerville, of Coombe Tracy, whose fingers played nervously over the stops of her Remington typewriter. Her cheeks were flushed with the exquisite bloom of the brunette, the dainty pink which lurks at the heart of the sulphur rose. Watson never made more candid confession than then. I was simply conscious that I was in the presence of a very handsome woman. It was a consciousness warmly and widely diffused and always doubled for the creature herself and for her covering. He spoke with equal enthusiasm at the same time of Beryl Stapleton, also from The Hound, with her perfect figure and elegant dress.
Well, let's be clear. Watson is out there on the moor. The women are few and far between. I mean, who's he got? He's got Laura Lyons, Beryl Stapleton, and Mrs. Barrymore to choose from. So, of course, he's going for 2 out of 3 here with the younger and more impressionable women. But he says, there's other passages, but I've said enough to remind the students of Watson's specific interest in Melodiana over many nations and 3 separate continents, a theme which few but Elmer Davis have ever examined candidly, and which is so murky that it even led to the gruesome suggestion of Mr. Rex Stout in his atrocious venture, Watson Was a Woman. Now, I just want to pause here because we're in the midst of this master's class on a Morley piece, and he brings up 2 other seminal Sherlockian pieces of scholarship. Elmer Davis's The Emotional Geology of Baker Street, which is from Vincent Sterrett's 221B, and Rex Stout's Watson Was a Woman, which was given in the remarks at a BSI dinner, and I believe published in Profile by Gaslight by Edgar Smith. So the readers of the time would have been very familiar with these 2 pieces that were published in 1940 and 1944, respectively.
Well, and also to add to that, as you just mentioned a few moments ago, Morley throws in what I think is a word he invented, miladiana, for talking about this category of clothing. I mean, it's a very Shakespearean thing, if it was original to him. Well, Morley now gets to a great point on his way to the end here. He says, and it's about Mary Morstan's and her skills as a dressmaker and the contribution that might have made to Watson's lifestyle. He says Mary Morstan found time on her hands after she and Watson moved into the house in Paddington. His medical practice was not very lucrative, and we know that because of one of the scenes where Holmes observed an aspect of Watson's attire is really, less than first rate, and it's because of the quality of the servant that they have. They had no children. Watson kept up his frequent sorties with Holmes, but Watson had a special interest in dressmaking, and so he encouraged Mary in her ambition to start a little business of her own. Mrs. Cecil Forrester and her friends were sure customers. The business spread. What else was the needlework which Mrs. Watson laid down that evening when her husband, giving his first yawn, heard Kate Whitney at the bell? There's Kate Whitney again. Begun at home by 1889 or 90, the business needed seamstress help and an atelier. Watson would not wish his friends to know his wife had gone into trade, so for her business style she adopted some name of fantasy, which has not yet been identified. A business directory in the early 90s would undoubtedly show some Madame Agra, maybe, or Madame Boulanger, or Madame Medico, or Morstan Styles, or Confections de Dames, doing business a little west of the Haute Couture. The bills were not as steep, perhaps, as those of Lesurrier on Bond Street, but it was a sound middle-class connection, and Watson, though he had countenanced this, was horribly ashamed.
Yeah, one wonders if it could have been Madame Lesurrier from Silver Blaze that was her business. An interesting crossover. Well, Morley kind of rounds the turn here and says, well, what else could account for the doctor's contradictory and baffling references? Mary was properly fond of him, but she had her own life to live and without the benefit of Sherlock. The sad bereavement to which Watson referred when Holmes came back in 94 was not the bereavement by death, but the fact that Mary and he had separated. Divorce, even if desired, was socially impossible in the holy deadlock of those days. There's another Morleyism, deadlock. Watson, I've pointed out before, Dr. Watson's secret, had a sly or a pawky camouflage of his own. As time and success went on, Mary wearied of giving her whole time to dressmaking, and Watson, at the age of 50, even grew a little fatigued with Holmes. Watson's so-called second marriage was when he and Mary decided to resume mutual bed and board. So, Watson's second wife was actually his first wife, and there never was a third.
Isn't that clever?
And
then Morley says so when John and Mary set up housekeeping afresh in Queen Anne Street around the autumn of 1902. Holmes began looking for property on the Sussex Downs. Mary farmed out the dressmaking business and said she had always wanted to write. Her first and last attempt at this was The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone.
That explains it.
Oh. And her influence on women's wear was not lost. Morstan Styles, or whatever the trade name was, became a limited company, and she and John still drew dividends. And in 1914, long relieved of money anxieties, Dr. Watson was still the same blithe boy.
Yeah, the business spread to the United States after the First War. How else do you account for More Style Frocks, Inc. in the Manhattan Telephone Book, or Morstan Textiles?
Oh, Mary Morstan and Watson. Morstan, Watson, Morstan. Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's very clever.
Yeah. Well, what a delightful take on things. And, when approaching scholarship like this, one has to have an inventive mind, a mind that, is still bound by the stories, but finds real world or reasonable explanations to patch things together. And I think Morley just does this in spades.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Surely we met at a garden party in Plymouth some time ago.
No, sir. You are mistaken.
No, do you know, I could have sworn it. You wore a costume of dove-coloured silk with ostrich feather trimming.
I never had such a dress, sir.
That quite settles it. Thank you.